All right, good morning. What my plan is today is to talk a little bit more about the relationship between inflation and unemployment, in particular within the context of the Phillips curve and then the two theories of aggregate supply that we introduced yesterday, the sticky price model and then the imperfect information model. We'll talk a little bit more about the sort of nature of what the structural reality of the economy in terms of competitive forces, what that would mean for a model in terms of sticky prices versus flexible prices. And then all of this is building towards us putting together a dynamic model of aggregate supply and aggregate demand. So let's just jump in. So I want to put some finishing touches on our Phillips curve discussion. We've talked a lot about it sort of from the initial idea, the sort of initial Phillips curve, the simple version. We've talked about the augmented Phillips curve. And so ultimately the augmented Phillips curve is the one that we are going to place into this broader macro model that we're building towards. We can get the Phillips curve from a relatively simple conception of aggregate supply. And the idea here is essentially that wherever we are relative to the output gap, that this is going to put us into a particular place with respect to what we might refer to as a price level gap, and so the price level gap is just the actual price level minus where we expect the price level to be. The output gap is wherever output is relative to full employment. Again, remember that we tend to think about output as full output or in terms of full employment. Now, it is, I think, to some extent useful to think about Y bar as being the expected output. So we can think about, output and then where we expect output to be and where we expect output to be would be at full employment. And then we have, of course, the unemployment gap. Here, again, we're thinking about this in terms of the natural rate of unemployment. We'll talk a little bit more about the natural rate of unemployment in just a moment. And then lastly, we can even think in terms of an unemployment gap, an inflation gap, where we can think about inflation relative to expected inflation. And the big sort of innovation of macroeconomics in the 70s, 80s, was this realization that it was these gaps, these realized values relative to their expectation that seems to, at the very least, drive a lot of economic behavior. That businesses seem to behave relative to a particular price gap, inflation gap, output gap, and it does something to the economic system, and that ultimately this is going to be especially important when we start thinking about the macroeconomy in a more dynamic sense and really starting to think about the effects of time, because these expectations are formed over time. The expectations are, of course, also updated over time. We'll have to think of how we might factor in that updating. In the context of the Phillips curve, we have a pretty simple way of thinking about this, right? So the basic sort of augmented Phillips curve, as it were, just says that inflation is equal to expected inflation minus, and then we have a beta parameter times the unemployment gap, and then we have the supply shock factor V. So, I think it's important to take a step back and when we look at this particular equation and see that the sort of evolution of economic thought is embedded in this particular equation, right? So, the original Phillips curve essentially just said that inflation was a linear relationship with unemployment, right? And then the problem that Friedman and folks in the monetarist school pointed out was that this model, the simple Phillips curve, did not involve any sort of adaptive expectations. And so basically, Friedman's contention is that a big part of inflation is what we expected inflation to be. So you can see the influence of the monetarists in the augmented Phillips curve model with the inclusion of inflation expectation. And then, the big sort of, more solidified point was also that we were going to think about inflation expectations as essentially being set where inflation expectations were inflation from last period. So whatever the most recent inflationary experience was, that created inflation created inflation expectations. And then the other thing too is that we can see that we have the sort of big Keynesian development in the 1970s was this idea of supply shock, right? That a big part of the inflationary story in the 70s wasn't just bad fiscal and monetary policy, even though there was a lot of bad fiscal and monetary policy going on. And certainly, I think that a lot of that bad fiscal and monetary policy in the late 60s, early 70s is certainly inflationary. There was, in addition to that, these adverse negative supply shocks in the U.S. economy, and Keynesians sort of strongly believe that that was a big part of the inflation story as well. And so we can see the inclusion there. So I just like to kind of point out, that the sort of modern conception of the Phillips curve is, two steps, far away from the original Phillips curve, and includes both the influence of monetarists as well as Keynesians, which again, in a world where we sort of are talking about sort of policy debates and sort of schools of thought debates, I think it's cool to see, these different schools of thought showing up in the same model. Okay, and so, one of the big things is that this development in particular, the expectations development, is really important, and I think is again something that even people sort of who supported or thought about the Phillips curve thought, oh, okay, this makes a lot of sense. And what's important about the expectations part is that the expectations part can potentially cause a shift of the Phillips curve. Changes in expected inflation, if you expect higher inflation, this in fact shifts the Phillips curve up. Now, this is of course important because what that would mean is that, for the same level of unemployment, we would actually get higher inflation. So the adaptive expectation, just inflation expectations critique of the Phillips curve was that inflation ends up not simply being a function of the unemployment gap, but also includes inflation expectation. In particular, that when inflation expectations go up, this tends to increase the realized inflation for any given particular level of unemployment. And this is a critique of the sort of Phillips curve that Friedman definitely laid out, and was really seen for at least a decade probably of the 1970s as in many ways being a knife through the heart of the Phillips curve. But folks such as Blinder and those kinds of folks, they came along and they said, well, look, the beauty of the Phillips curve, and this really gets back to the beauty of structural theory, is that you can embed these ideas. So if you think that inflation has inertia, we can put that into the model. And by the way, you can accommodate all sorts of different types of inflation inertia into a Phillips curve model, right? So just as a particular point, just to kind of as a brief diversion, right? We can think about a Phillips curve something like this, where we say that inflation in time period t is equal to, and then that inflation expectation, maybe we think it's an average of the last three, periods of inflation. And so we have pi t minus 1 plus pi t minus 2 plus pi t minus 3. And then, of course, just divide that all by 3. And then plus, and then the output, or the unemployment gap, rather. And then plus those supply shocks. So you can see that if you think that there is this really complicated sort of complicated idea behind inflation expectations, which of course that was a lot of what the monetarists and sort of post-Keynesians were arguing, you can put that into the Phillips curve. So you can make the expectations part of the Phillips curve very complicated if you want to, because if you think that inflation has this very complicated inertia type process, you can actually model that particular process. And then later on, of course, we can test these things empirically, run regressions, and see if in fact things tend to hold up. In other words, for example, however we choose to conceive of inflation expectations, do those seem to actually lead to higher inflation? So in other words, when we see that inflation expectations are higher, do we then tend to see higher inflation in the future, even if the economic system hasn't actually grown? And there was some pretty solid evidence of that, certainly. Okay, now let's talk a little bit about the Lucas critique, and then say a little bit about sort of the big picture here. And then what we'll do is we'll sort of wrap up. We'll talk a little bit about rational expectations, the concept of a hysteresis, and that, and then kind of put a nice little capper on this conversation as we get into the dynamic ASAV. So, as I already mentioned to you previously, the Lucas critique is not a theoretical critique of the Phillips curve. The Lucas critique is basically an argument that says that the initial Phillips curve paper, written in I believe 1958, suffered from econometric problems, and then also that the subsequent Samuelson, I believe Samuelson solo paper, that was also in the I think mid 1960s, which tested the Phillips curve using U.S. data and found a Phillips curve-like set of behaviors from the U.S. data. Remember that in Phillips' initial paper, he only looked at data from the United Kingdom. Now, he did look at that data over a very, very long time period. And then when that sort of same kind of econometric method was looked at in terms of the U.S. data, there was a very similar relationship found. What Lucas argued, and he has a very strong econometric background to his argument, is that basically those papers were done incorrectly empirically, that essentially the relationship between unemployment and sort of the unemployment gap and inflation was to some extent illusory. And Lucas's sort of critique of this was that beta coefficient, within the Phillips curve. Again, that's what we're testing empirically. We're measuring the extent of the relationship between the unemployment gap and inflation. And basically what Lucas argued is that the estimation of that beta was incorrect, right? One of the sort of important ideas in empirical economics is that when you estimate a variable, so beta, again, we're estimating the beta in the traditional Phillips curve. And again, remember, the beta is the change in inflation relative to a change in the unemployment gap. So when you estimate this parameter, and we'll call that beta hat. So beta hat is the estimate of beta. There is a set of statistical laws, probability, things like that, that basically argues that under the law of large numbers and iterated expectations, that the estimated beta parameter will converge to what is essentially the real coefficient estimate. So we can imagine that there is a relationship between the unemployment gap and inflation, and that we can attempt to measure it. And if we have low sample sizes, then our attempt to measure it will likely be off, will be biased. And there's all sorts of other reasons why our estimates could be biased. But the sort of econometric theory says that, well, under proper sampling, good sample size, and some other issues related to control variables and confounding and all that, that the estimated value of beta converges to the real value of beta if your modeling is done correct. And basically what Lucas is saying is that the modeling was not done necessarily correctly. And I think Lucas's sort of broader point was really that the entire idea of trying to estimate the relationship between unemployment and inflation was rife with all sorts of econometric problems, to the extent that I think Lucas's main argument was you can't trust the Phillips curve paper, you can't trust the Samuelson Solo paper on American data. That those papers were, in a sense, a facade in many ways. And as a result, what Lucas sort of was highly critical of was this discretionary monetary policy, because it was sort of Lucas's contention that the Phillips curve gave a false premise. And the reason why the Phillips curve gave a false premise is because the original Phillips curve paper was done econometrically poorly. And so for him, it was a frightening sort of consequence of bad econometrics that we would then follow the Phillips curve in terms of policy. Luckily for economics as well as Phillips, what we found is that while Lucas was very sound in terms of his sort of econometric arguments against the initial estimations of the Phillips curve, we would actually sort of find out later on, and interestingly enough, by someone who was certainly initially in Lucas's camp, Thomas Sargent. So Sargent sort of argued that the Lucas critique is true. Lucas is right about the econometric problems, but to his sort of opinion, it did, or not his opinion, but according to his research, it didn't even matter that the estimation of beta was not the important part of, in other words, the sort of Phillips curve. And in many ways, Sargent kind of argued that the Phillips curve, again, is not something that we should necessarily put too much stock in. So as opposed to adapting the Phillips curve to these ideas of expectation, Sargent essentially argued, and he makes a very classical argument here, is that inflation does not necessarily follow adaptive expectations, right? Even though Lucas is correct that inflation seems to have inertia, to Sargent's sort of contention, it's not necessarily about inflation expectations, but rather about what Sargent would refer to as rational expectations. And the idea behind rational expectations was that we factor in not merely inflation expectations, but we factor in expectations about all other aspects of the economy, including policy. So we have, in a sense, policy expectations that then create and generate our expectations over variables. And then in Sargent's world, through this sort of rational expectations model, we get sort of what we expect. And so you get the kind of classic story here of inflation expectations creating a sense that inflation is going to happen. People alter their behavior, not only because of the expected inflation, but also because of the expected policy response to inflation. And that was a big thing, right? The sort of notion of Phillips trade-off between the unemployment gap and inflation, in a sense, rested upon a behavioral response to the government either running, a fiscal stimulus or the central bank running a monetary stimulus, and that people then responded to those policies by behaving. What Sargent argued was that the policy merely becomes another part of the expectations generation, to the extent that his argument is that if you signal a particular policy, people will already behave according to what they think that policy is going to do. Sargent takes this a step further, does a bunch of really fancy math with it, and basically argues is that rational expectations should cause markets to completely clear. So we've kind of come full circle. So at the kind of tail end of the 1970s and up to the mid 1980s, we've sort of come back to the classical world. We're back to now thinking in terms of complete market clearing. And that sort of complete market clearing was, interestingly enough, in part a response to the success and then somewhat sort of the initial demise of the Phillips curve. What's interesting about this sort of story is that, like the proverbial phoenix rising from the ashes, the Phillips curve makes this sort of wonderful comeback in the 90s and 2000s, despite the fact that, as we've previously talked, empirical evidence would suggest that the relationship is flattening over time, right? That the beta estimation has been decreasing. It's still there. It still exists in the paper, right? Mankiw found that the beta parameter had decreased over time, although still was statistically significant. Blanchard also found that despite statistical significance, the beta parameter had fallen. And so the idea there is that the Phillips curve is getting flatter over time. Not necessarily going away, but getting flatter. Now, what I was saying before about the sort of irony here is that when we get into the sort of big picture of the dynamic part of the economy, it became clear, I think, to a lot of economists that if you want to have a dynamic sense of aggregate supply, the Phillips curve offered probably the best way for us to then put that story together with inflation. The trick is that the Phillips curve has to be a part of a more dynamical model that includes not just the Phillips curve, but as we'll see in the next set of lectures, in addition, things like the quantity equation, and in addition, things like adaptive expectations. And so what we're going to have in the dynamic ASCD model is much like the development of ISLM, the development of Mundell-Fleming, was taking of these initial ideas and theories and then adapting them in a sort of dichotomous way, both in terms of the empirical stylized facts that were being measured and observed during this time period, but also the real innovative theoretical evolution that was also occurring at this particular time. So there was this massive upheaval in macroeconomic thought in the 60s, 70s, 80s. And then kind of as we went into the 90s, what you had was this sort of consolidation of ideas that was a real grab bag of all of the stuff that we've been talking about. So the sort of modern conception of the economy is influenced by classical, neoclassicals, Keynesians, monetarists, post-Keynesian, real business cycle folk, which again, I think is to some extent certainly optimistic.